Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. It's the same to you, all Hey y'all, it's Kelly. Welcome to the Ground Shots podcast. I'm currently in Durango, Colorado, and I just spent a month in the Southwest in the wilderness with Signal Fire, and it's an organization I mentioned a couple times on the podcast and have interviewed a bunch of alumni of this really super sweet organization. And we went to the Gila National Forest, we went to the Blue Range Primitive Area, and a couple other areas of New Mexico and Arizona. I'm still processing a lot of what we experienced during this trip, including visiting Oak Flat, which is a super special sacred grounds for Apache folks that is just north of Phoenix, Arizona, about northeast. And it's slated to become a big mine through a bunch of really crazy things that happened, and I'll link in the show notes to an organization where you can find out more about what's happening at Oak Flat. Also, while I've been here in Durango, I've been helping my friend Gabe plant wapato, tubers, camas bulbs, and yampa seeds for his wild tending projects, which is something he does pretty much full-time. And I've been doing some interviews this summer on wild tending with different folks, and I haven't released many of them yet, but in the next few months I will be releasing more conversations about wild tending, which I think is a really important topic to touch on. So stay tuned for that. And I'm really excited about this episode of the podcast. It is a conversation with Laura Pendell, who is a writer, artist, and was the partner of the late ethnobotanist Dale Pendell, which many people might know if you're into plants. Laura and I got together after a few different meetups around Nevada City, California, where she lives, and we decided to record this conversation in her and Dale's shared library and studio in Penn Valley, California this past summer. We got together to record this conversation to celebrate Dale's work, his perspective, and unique way in the world. I met Dale and Laura years ago at the United Plant Savers Golden Seal Sanctuary in Southeast Ohio. It was kind of a random thing. I was caretaking at the sanctuary, and Dale and Laura were driving cross country from the International Herb Symposium, and they stopped in to see the place, and my friend Ashley and I were there, and we ended up giving them kind of a tour and showing them around, and they gave us a little chapbook at the end of the meeting and a bottle of absinthe that Dale had made, and I remember him telling me, "Don't drink this alone," and I didn't really know who he was at the time. But then later that summer, I ended up finding out about his Pharmako books. I'm really grateful that Laura took the time to meet up with me to chat about Dale's writings and poetry and his ways. So Dale Pendell was most known for his books in the Pharmako trilogy, a project that explored the use, history, pharmacology, sociology, experience, chemistry, and alchemy of most plants or substances considered psychoactive. He also wrote novels, poetry, and had a pretty unique writing style that mixed experience, research, poetry, and old folklore. So in this conversation, we talk about Dale's nature of exploration and the way that he navigated his many interests. And we talk about the Pharmako trilogy, the 3 books that he's most known for, and its demonstration of Dale's experimental and experiential nature with plants. We talk about Dale's incredible memory and ability to hold information, and we speak on Dale's ability to combine different facets of things together in his work. We speak a little bit about some of Dale's unfinished and unpublished works, including a book on his prison experiences in Mexico and the U.S., and a collected writings book that is in the works that Laura's organizing with some other folks. We speak on Dale and Laura's camp project during the early years of Burning Man, and Dale's book Inspired Madness, which is a reflection on that camp. We speak on Dale's talks on Horizon Anarchism, which he did at Burning Man, and I linked in the show notes to an audio clip of that talk. We speak on Dale's artist book, The Gold Dust Wilderness, which is one of the first works he published and silkscreened, and it's based on his experience living off-grid on a mining claim in Trinity County, California in the 1970s. And this book was the genesis of his unique writing style, mixing information, imagination, and poetry, and it was super cool to see in person and be able to flip through. It's a pretty large artist book, and it's just so thoughtfully done and beautiful, and it would be so cool if more people could see it, but I don't know if it's going to make sense to put it out in the world. But I was grateful to be able to experience it. We talked about Dale's herbal root beer, elixir, and absinthe projects, and I tasted Dale's absinthe when he gave me and Ashley like a half a bottle, or actually it's a mouthwash, but it's absinthe. And we talk about Laura's connection to poetry and absinthe. We speak on Dale and Laura's connection to Zen Buddhism. And Laura reads some of Dale's poetry in this piece, which is super awesome. And she reads the Ballad of Hungry Ghosts, Medicine, and Stonecrop, among a few others. We talk a little bit about Dale's amazing herbarium collection that he compiled over several decades in Nevada County, California, and beyond. And it was over 1,000 specimens, and I got to see a few of them that Laura had pulled out, and it's pretty amazing. We then finally speak on Dale's relationship with the psychedelic and drug database Arrowhead, which I remember looking at when I was growing up, and it's still out there, and it's still an amazing database of information about plants and mind-altering substances. So I'm super excited to share this interview with y'all, and if you enjoy this podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes and leave us a review. I love to read those. And also support us on Patreon. We would love that and love to have you there. And I think with that, I really want to go ahead and get to the episode. So enjoy this conversation with Laura, y'all. Happy listening. Burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn with the heat that will warm these places.
We are sitting in the library. There's over 10,000 books here. Dale built the library, all of the shelves and everything that you see, he built. The only thing that we purchased is the library ladder down at that end. But he built everything else. One of the reasons that we bought this land was because there was an empty barn, and we knew we could turn it into a library. And between the two of us, we needed that kind of space for all the books.
How would you describe Dale as a person and his process with his work? You've described him before when we met up that he just studies things and he remembers so much information, and he'll remember something he read in a book like years ago, and it seems like obviously it takes that kind of mind to produce what he did. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an idea of him. And yeah,
going all the way back to childhood, according to his relatives, if he found something that he was curious about, he just figured it out. For example, when he was young, I'm going to say 7, maybe 8, but it might have been a little bit younger, he got curious about chess. So I don't know, maybe there was a book in the house about chess. I don't really know. I mean, he couldn't go on the internet to find out about it, but he got really curious about chess, so he made a chess set. He made the board, he made all the different pieces, and then I believe he had an older brother and a younger brother. I believe he taught his younger brother the basic rules. Wow. And they started playing chess together. So his incredible curiosity and ability to teach himself about things that he wanted to know more about were evident through his entire life. Even up until the end, when he wasn't really well enough to go into the mountains or anything, we would walk around the knoll that's here on the property. and he got intensely curious about the holes that were in the road. And he wanted to know what was making those holes in the road. And I think that that's a photocopy of an article that showed up. Am I right? Does it say
Holes
who's
in the
making all
ground?
these holes? Yeah. So he did a lot of research, and then he wrote a wonderful piece about the holes in the ground. The same thing happened with wasps. There's a lot of wasps up here, and he got really curious. So he did wasp taxonomy.
Wow.
Figured out exactly what wasp we had and why, and wrote a piece all about wasps. It was just the nature of his mind to be curious about everything. And he got curious about geology, which actually goes back to the years that the Gold Dust Wilderness, his big, large coffee table artist book, talks about. He was in the mountains, and as he put it, in order to be somebody who looks for gold, you have to understand the geology of the area as well as the mechanics of how to pan for gold. And so there's nothing ever stopped him intellectually. And one can push that a little bit further and say very little stopped him experientially, which is why when he first became curious about plants, you have to remember that he grew up in the 60s when a lot of the what we call today recreational drugs were readily available. They weren't illegal or anything. And he was an explorer. He was an explorer of consciousness. He was an explorer of experiences. He was an explorer of whatever he came across, plants in particular. And so he wasn't afraid to explore. And so the Pharmako books, for which he's probably,
most famous
best
for.
known,
Yeah.
are basically his exploration of plants beyond what you're going to see in, is it Munns or some of the
Or Michael Moore's books, or like field guides, and it's
Yeah.
like a combination of
but it's
all of it.
it's experiential, and his goal was to so thoroughly inhabit whatever plant he was talking about that it would show up in his writing.
Wow.
So that each chapter would have a unique signature, just like each plant had.
Wow.
And, other people can be the judges to whether he, succeeded in doing that or not. But even the Pharmako books talk about the history of the plant, its historical
Pharmacology in there too.
the pharmacology, its historical impact in the world. I think it's the coffee chapter that reads like a romance novel because of how, this guy gave this plant to a woman who took it someplace else. And, there's all kinds of things. And there's poetry in there. I mean, he envisioned it as a long, epic poem. But his method of writing was immersion in that particular plant. But you see that in everything. I mean, again, his method of writing about the holes in the ground was a kind of similar immersion, on why are some this size and why are some larger and why are some smaller and who's jumping out of what hole and why, who's living in what hole and why. I mean, he was just an immensely curious person who was able to retain all of this. I mean, a lot of us get curious about stuff, but then enough years go by and it's kind of like we need a refresher course. He seemed to be like a walking encyclopedia in the best sense, And in the years that we were together, what I noticed was I got pretty lazy because if we were sitting in the hot tub looking at the sky at night, I could always say to him, what's the name of that star again? And he would know. I didn't have to, remember it myself if I didn't want to, and
he would always be like,
he was always there. He was this endless source of information. That made him pretty unique and special, because most people, even if they know a topic really, really well, that's the topic that they know.
Mm-hmm.
It
seemed like there weren't bounds. Obviously, he really loved plants, but it seemed like there weren't bounds to his curiosity.
That's true. Yeah. His and so he studied the Civil War, for example. Wow. He was, and he could converse with Civil War people. We made a trip to the East Coast once, and we were at Gettysburg for a couple of days. And anytime he'd run into another Civil War guy, they would have, well, do you think that this happened? Do you think they came from this direction? Do you think they went into, and I would just sit there and kind of go like, well, okay, but everything was fascinating to him. And as I said, he retained that information far beyond the way most of us retain information, mm-hmm. and then was able to
share it.
So the Pharmako books are about plants. During the years that we went to Burning Man, he wrote a book of, he took all the years and kind of mixed them up into, one particular unidentified year at Burning Man. But he interspersed the Burning Man book with what it was like to be there on the playa, and then he would have a chapter about the anarchistic mindset of some of the people there, or the political aspect of it. So that's another thing that's indicative of his style of writing. He never kind of just wrote a straight piece.
It's nonlinear in a lot of ways.
It's nonlinear, but it always combines all these different facets. So that was I think what made him so uniquely and endlessly interesting. Was not just his own curiosity, but it's making me think about the fact that when we were in London, we visited a lot of the historical places that were the first coffee shops, because coffee was one of the things. People stopped drinking beer. They couldn't drink the water, but they got coffee, and they would go to the coffee shop and talk politics. And that's, again, in the Pharmako books. So, again, not linear, but all of the different, it's
like a web coming together, or like a diamond with different faces.
Yes. Yeah. And, or like a web, mm-hmm. Or the net of Indra, mm-hmm. With lots of facets. And he had a unique skill to be able to combine them. I mean, a lot of people can know a lot of stuff, but they can't figure out how to put it all together.
Things that seem not related, but getting them to connect. Yeah.
And that was a unique skill that he had.
I know in the Pharmako books, it is, that was one of the first things. I haven't read each one of them from cover to cover. It's one of those where I open it up and I'm interested in a plant, and I really get into that one for a while, and then next month I'll open it up again, and that just... Yeah.
That was his intention.
Really? Okay.
He never thought of them as books that had to be read cover to cover. Mm-hmm. And again, because they're not linear in that sense. Mm-hmm. So you can just open it up to wherever and read about whatever plant you're particularly interested in. But
there's a container too, because they're themed, mm-hmm. Poeia, Gnosis, the power plants or the poison plants. And so okay, this sort of group had this thing in common. And
when he started on the book, as far as I know, because it was before we actually met, I met him after Poeia had already been published. As a matter of fact, it was out of print when we first met, and back then there was no Amazon or anything, and tracking down a copy of that book was nearly impossible. I had
he put them out one at a time over a period of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I had to go actually to the big public library in New York City, the one that has the two lions in front. And they had one copy in all of New York City.
What?
In the reading room. In the reading room. You couldn't even take it out.
Wow.
You had to sit there and read it. That is not the case anymore. I'm delighted to say. Well, you can't find them anywhere, but you can. They're in libraries now. Anyway, that book was the only one that he had written, but there were other books, other plants that he wanted to address in this same style, and so he was working on Dynamis when we met, and after enough years, Gnosis came along, but he did not envision it as a trilogy when he first started. It was supposed to be one book, but it turned into more.
To 3. So
yeah,
his curiosity continued to different groups of plants.
Yeah, it just
made itself in a way.
Yeah, I think for example, he used to laugh that in Dynamis, the longest chapters are about, the stimulants. Because in the total immersion style of writing, that's going to make you write more and more and more and more and more.
Like drinking coffee while writing about coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. As opposed to some of the other substances. But most of his books, you can kind of open any place you want and read that section, and they stand alone. That's been one of the problems that people have had with The Great Bay, his novel that's placed in the future, except it's not so far from
you're saying
now anymore.
It kind of could come true.
What it gives you is, if you're curious as to what Dale imagined this world might be like 5,000 years from now, you can just read the 5,000 years from now story. And it's not dependent upon what came before or what comes after. I mean, they stand alone.
That's one I haven't seen as much out there. I know we were talking about it last time. It just isn't the first one that people pick up of his books. It's usually the trilogy.
Yeah. Well, that's what he's best known for, and that's what's been translated into a couple of different languages. Wow. The Burning Man book, people that have read it say it really at least represents what Burning Man was for them. The Burning Man organization held it at arm's distance because he wasn't afraid to talk about drug use on the playa, and they like to think of themselves as an art coalition. And maybe over the the last time we were there was 2007, so maybe in the past 12 years it's changed from
our political climate, or at least maybe our social climate has changed a little bit. I mean, people have always been doing mind-altering substances, but our acknowledgement of them is more mainstream now. So
anyway, the people at Burning Man wouldn't. I mean, it's on the list. If you look at, I think if you go to Burning Man's website and you ask for books that are written about Burning Man, it shows up eventually.
Okay.
But they didn't promote it. I think they also didn't promote it because it doesn't have pictures in it. It has drawings in it, but it doesn't have pictures of things on the playa. And
all the grandiose sculptures and things.
So,
will you speak a little bit more to that? You were talking about it earlier, that y'all went for many years to Burning Man, and I've never been, but I've always been curious about it.
So when we first started going to Burning Man, there were maybe 7,000 people there. And it was very much a do-it-yourself experience. This was before they had the large camps that you could buy it sounds like you're paying for a tour or a motel room or something. that did not exist when we first went. And it was smaller. It was still just as creative and wild, and a lot less crowded. And the first year or two that we were there, whatever police presence there might have been was basically invisible. And then all of a sudden you started to see police cars, and the presence was...
You feel like that increased when more people started coming?
Could be. And when the BLM people and everything decided that this was a good way to make money every year, I'm sure all of that added. And it grew in popularity. I mean, it got a rep. You know, it was like, if you haven't been to Woodstock, make sure you get to Burning Man. And then it started to draw an international crowd. I think that back in 1998 or 99, when we first went together, pretty much, I mean, it wasn't a local event, but it had, you know, a homegrown kind of sense to it. Within a very short number of years, if you needed a permit, you needed you needed to be on a list. If you were going to show up early and set your camp up, they started checking names off. I mean, the whole tenor of it changed. You had to submit a plan and explain how you were going to do this and how you were going to do that, and what you were going to do with your gray water, which burners were doing anyway. You know, it wasn't like they needed official regulation, because most of the people that were there, at least when I first started going, were, you know, treasured the land and the environment. They weren't into trashing the place. But then the government, the BLM people the police started coming down on Burning Man, and so it just kind of tumbled into a much more official situation.
What kind of projects did y'all bring to that?
Well, we created something that we called Oracular Madness, and it started off. We were part of another camp. We were like a sub-camp of another camp, and it was very spontaneous. We had a boombox, and we were sitting together, and I don't know, I guess we had music on, and Dale started just rambling and talking, and people just gathered around us. And over the next couple of years, we kind of refined that. And I remember one Burning Man, we were actually in our tent. Maybe the weather was a little inclement. That part I'm not sure on. And people started knocking on the door of our tent because, I don't know, good vibes were coming out. And I think Dale writes about that a little bit in Inspired Madness. Anyway, we finally dragged our bed out in front of the tent and just sat there and kind of did a John and Yoko thing for the rest of the evening. Wow. And then we used that as a jumping off thing, so that years later, the circumstances aren't important, we actually went out into the middle of the playa on Friday night with a big mattress, and we set a whole ring of bags that had sand and candles in them around us, and just kind of sat there, and people would just stop by and visit and hang out. But the basic concept behind Oracular Madness, which developed over a period of years, was we had this big tie-dyed tent that was all lit from the inside with cool neon wire. So it looked, I will show you a picture. I mean, it looked really inviting and spectacular. And we had mattresses and stuff inside, and it was a kind of a chill space. But at that point, we had many musician friends. And so we had all our instruments set up at the back of the Oraculon, and we had a common microphone. And anybody who came in from the playa, the first thing we said is, "How is it out there?" And they were our oracles. and they would come to the microphone and tell us, well, I saw this amazing thing, or I don't know, it's dark, or it's this, or it's that. And we would build a song around whatever they said. And we had a looping machine. So if they said something, we could loop it and play it over and over again. And it was pretty special and pretty spectacular. And we kind of tried to do that night after night after night. And so we stayed at home in the Oraculon a lot, rather than, which is not to say that we didn't venture out onto the playa. We did that also, but it was a combination of the two. And it was called Oracular Madness, and it basically fed off of what people would bring us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very spontaneous. You never knew how it was going to go. We never knew how many musicians were willing to hang out and how many of them wanted to go out and party on the playa. So it was all very spontaneous.
Are there any recordings of any evenings or like sessions of that?
I don't know the answer to that.
I mean,
I suspect probably not, because the nature of it was, we were all a little too preoccupied with other things to be running something that would tape anything. Mm-hmm. But it's possible there are some, but the sound quality probably is totally sucko. If you want a sense of it, read Inspired Madness. Dale does a pretty good job of recreating.
Never read that. Yeah. That'd be cool.
It's a skinny little book. Mm-hmm. He does a pretty good job of recreating what life was like in the Oraculon, and with the cast of characters that we had, pretty much ongoing for year after year after year. I think our first camp, official camp, was the year 2000. And the last time was in the year 2006, when we did a joint camp with the folks from Arrowwood. Mm. So they had their tent, and we had the Oraculon, and they were more of a daytime place where they had talks and things going on, and then we were kind of the nighttime entertainment. And by then, in 2006, again, the paperwork to have a camp that you had to fill out and explain what you were doing and why you were doing it and how you were going to clean up and who was going to be there and everything was just so overwhelming that I kind of went, I'm not sure I want to fill out all this paperwork. So the Arrowwoods were game for that. And what did we call it? The Oracle at Arrowwood, I think, was what we called the camp that year.
They helped get it going and do all the paperwork.
Yeah, they did a lot of that kind of stuff. And then in 2007, when we went, we just were many streets down. Some other friends had a camping spot, and we stayed. I think we left early that year. Wow. It just got crowded. It just had lost some of its cachet for us, which again I want to emphasize doesn't mean that it's still not a very special thing to do. And I have treasured memories from every year that we were there. So last year, I created a big banner in Dale's honor to be placed in the temple. And so at the very last moment, I mean, we were talking like 2 days before Burning Man starts, I thought, maybe I should go and do it myself. As it turns out, this core group of people that have been going there all these years, whose camp we first camped at in 1998 and are still going, took the banner and installed it. But I did have this feeling like I should be there maybe, and not only could could I not get a ticket? I mean, it wasn't even a matter of I didn't mind spending $1,000 to get a ticket. There just were no tickets available to get. And so I didn't make it there.
There was no way that they could figure out some...
They tried. They went on their, whatever it is, internet thing saying, does anybody have a ticket they're not going to use after all? You know, Laura would like one, but no. So it never happened. And it's okay. It's okay. Mm-hmm. I have pictures of how they installed the banner. And then what happened was here at Mantis Hill, we had, on the night of the burn, we had a mini burn here. And with a few close friends. So we had a burn at the same time that they were having a burn on the playa, and
channeling it.
Yeah, it was okay. It was okay. And I saved $1,000 or probably way more. So Burning Man was a big event in our lives, because you can't just decide, okay, I'm going to go to Burning Man and throw a bunch of stuff in your car. It takes a lot of preparation. I mean, you got to figure out how much water you need. What are you going to do with the water that is dirty now? You can't just splash it on the playa. How are you going to shower? What about food? How much ice? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of planning. You can't just kind of casually, I guess people do, but you can't just casually walk in and go like, hi, I'm here. So it took a lot of energy, and that was in the early years when Dale and I had first met, and he was still working on Dynamis and then on Gnosis. And then, as I said, it just lost some of its aliveness for us. And what was it that Dale said? That we were just going to go basically backpacking into the mountains where there was a lake that we could jump into, because the desert, is a big part of your Burning Man experience in terms of sand, in everything. I mean,
wind, sand, dryness.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what you do. You can't make I guess there are ways. I mean, you can go in an RV, and that will reduce the fact that everything that you're looking for is covered with dust after enough days. But that kind of, that defeats the whole purpose of being close to the earth and being close to the experience. At least that's how we saw it. So every year, not every year, but the last couple of years that we were at Burning Man, it was like I went, okay, if we come back next year, we're renting an RV. And then, of course, the next year would come and it just would be like, no. And then, by the end of the week, when everything is covered with dust,
you think about it again.
You think about it again. And finally, it just seemed like maybe we should just go into the mountains and have a nice cold lake to jump into.
That sounds really nice.
And not have a lot of people to deal with and all that other kind of crazy stuff. So, and also Dale's, Dale gave talks at Burning Man, and some of those are recorded. You can, they're not filmed, but they are recorded.
Through Arrowwood? Or just through other camps?
Through, Matrix Masters, I think is what it's called. Okay. I mean, there's one talk in particular that he gave on Horizon Anarchism. You can hear it.
Cool. I'll look that up. Curious.
But by then also we were going to conferences and everything, and everything takes time, and we had moved up. We had moved up here, and so getting this place together was taking time and energy, and you just can't necessarily do everything. And I think that Burning Man, again, had kind of run its course for us.
Do you feel like that Burning Man was a part of the process of his sort of... I mean, I don't really know. I wasn't there, but like he emerged as someone who had like something really important to say. And I guess I'm curious, like...
Well, I think that there were always a lot of people at Burning Man who knew him through the Pharmako books. And even though it's not like you don't have a banner outside your camp that says, Dale Pendell is here, word of mouth or whatever would spread. And so, we had people who stopped by the camp, to hang out. Yes. And we met people at the camp who then became friends. And, I mean, it's a pretty amazing place that way.
Mm-hmm. He seemed really approachable because we met this one random time in Ohio.
Yeah.
All of us. And
well, that was after we had been at the
International Herb Symposium.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And Rosemary had said, no, if you're driving, we had driven across the country to go to that. Now we were going to drive back, and we didn't really want to retrace our steps. Mm-hmm. And Rosemary said, no, you have to go to UPS, and you have to, check that out. So that's what we did.
I was just there. I had no idea who he was either at the time. Until after y'all were like, oh, you should take this little chapbook we have, or like, oh, right, and then later I was like, oh, this person, but he seemed super approachable. I mean, for someone who too is so smart, often like those people, you don't know how do I have a conversation with you? It seems like you know so much more, but it just, wouldn't know. Like, I remember him asking me and my friend Ashley were there, like he wanted to see Dogbane or something.
Probably.
Yeah. But he didn't let on that he knew a whole bunch about Dogbane, I remember. And so we're like, yeah, let's go. We're going on the trail and see Dogbane. Yeah, so I remember that. I remember him telling me to try it out, too. The plant, even though it's poisonous.
What I remember from that visit in particular was that you, having grown up on the East Coast, couldn't imagine what it was like to live someplace where there was a dry season. And we talked about that, as I recall. And then as we left and drove across, I guess, southern Ohio, and we saw lawn after lawn after lawn, and we were like, oh, that's why she couldn't imagine what it's like to live in a drought area, in a place where if you don't water, everything just fades away, because it's not part of her experience. Mm-hmm. So that's the thing that I take, when I think about that visit, that's the thing that I take away the most.
Yeah, I hadn't been west of the Mississippi at that point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, now you've gotten a good dose of dry summers and fire danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dryness is nice in certain ways. It's not so moldy but then you have the fire. It's like a totally different world.
Well, now, the fire danger has only gotten this dramatic in the past 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. Where it really is a conscious decision. No, I can't leave the house because, I can leave the house to go into town and go grocery shopping, but I can't just pack up the car and drive off, because who's going to be here to keep, in case we have to evacuate.
I did not finish the Great Bay. But was there fire stuff written in that? Do you know? Like in his future idea of what...
I don't think so, because his whole idea was based on the fact that sea level had risen so much that we now had that the Central Valley was now just a giant ocean. And Mantis Hill was waterfront property. There's a story towards the end. What's it called? The Sand Listener, I think it's called, which speaks of a drier time. The Sand Listeners and the Mojave River, 6,000 years later. And that sand figures into that part.
Yeah, just curious.
There's it's a little bit based on the Kelso Dunes, so that the sand speaks and gives messages and has an oracular quality to it. And so this shaman woman actually dives into the sand.
Wow.
And swims through the sand into another world and then resurfaces with messages. It's probably my favorite story in the whole book. So I highly recommend it.
If only my love could find me in this life. If only my love could find me, I'd break down all the walls that stood between us. I'd break all the walls that stood between us. But death is no wall to break or climb. Death is no wall for me to break.
Was Dale working on anything before he passed that isn't out?
Yes. Well, he has a book about, he calls it Solitary, about his prison experiences in both Mexico and also here in the United States. He was in a federal prison in San Antonio, Texas, for a year. And he compares what it's like to be in an American prison as opposed to a Mexican prison. I mean, it's dramatically different. But he also, in typical Dale style, intersperses it with prison history and stories about the prisons in the South, and people who tried to change the prison system. And that book is more or less finished, but probably needs another really good edit. And because it's not, a lot of the books that are being written about prison these days are kind of, what's the word that I'm looking for? You know, they talk about rapes and, you know, beating people up and everything. Dale doesn't put that in his books. So they're not like a vicarious prison experience in that sense. And I don't know if the publishers want to spend the time and the money to publish a book that won't attract that genre. That's just my own personal opinion. I've never talked with a publisher and said, so what's the problem here? So there is that book. And then there's another book that Dale wrote about the last outlaw here in Nevada County to be on a wanted dead or alive poster. And his name was Wild Bill Ebaugh. And Dale has it's a historically based novel about that character, and also talks about mining and what it was like to be in Nevada County at that particular time. And the problem was that when he finished writing it a couple of years ago, he didn't change the names of any of the people. It's kind of a little bit of a semi-unsolved mystery, but there are descendants from the people in the story who are still alive today. And the person who was going to publish it got scared at the last moment and was afraid that the descendants might say, how can you say that about my great-grandmother? You know.
Oh, wow.
So that book is still sitting there.
In limbo.
In limbo, yeah, and everything. And maybe...
one day it'll make sense to put
maybe
out.
It'll be publishable eventually, or maybe it'll be in Dale's archives wherever they wind up and somebody else can pull it out. I don't know if I have the time and the energy to pull them together into a publishable form and then find somebody to publish them. I don't know. But there are 2 books that are pretty much completed that, could go to press if all of a sudden somebody was to say, well, is there any other Dale Pendell stuff around?
And people are craving more.
Yeah.
And well.
But they're not like the Pharmako books. And most of the people who are craving more, that's the kind of book they're craving. And the prison book has, some...
It's really fascinating to me, the idea of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really important.
Yeah. I mean, it was because he was moving marijuana, back at the time when moving marijuana was not, a cool thing to be doing. We're going back to the 60s. Mm-hmm. And anyway, so there are those 2 books. And other than that...
You're mentioning some sort of compilation that's being put together, right?
Yeah. Andrew Schelling, who's at Naropa and a long time friend of Dale's, and I were actually asked by Dale to pull together a collected and selected, which would be a bunch of stories. For example, Catamaran, which is a literary magazine out of Santa Cruz, published 3 or maybe it's 4 stories that Dale wrote. One of them is actually the first chapter of the prison book.
Oh, cool.
And one of them is the Holes in the Ground story that's here. And so I'm sure we won't have any trouble getting Catamaran to give us the rights to publish that, and the Wasp story, and what's the other one? The other one's about, it's a geology story about the land that we live on, called Tracing the Pluton. So we want to pull together stuff that's out there but not easily available at all. And since The Language of Birds is out of print, that's Dale's book on divination and chants, I think that we can perhaps incorporate, if not that entire book, it's a small book, parts of it, so that people will have their appetite whetted and then go buy the actual book.
And you were saying, because you showed me this really beautiful artist book last time I was here too, that's based on Dale's experience living in the wilderness in Trinity County, California, and
where he had a mining claim.
Wow.
And he mined for gold. And as a matter of fact, my wedding band is made out of some of the gold that he mined back then. And back then, that was the day when it was the height of the Renaissance fairs. So everybody would go to the Renaissance fairs, and maybe they'd have tooled leather belts, or maybe they'd have, I don't know, postcards, or whatever they would have that they would trade and sell and everything else. And so Dale wanted to have something also. So he silk screened a book and hand bound it. It's 125 copies all told.
It's called The Gold Dust
It's
Wilderness.
called The Gold Dust Wilderness. And it's filled with poems. It's filled with historical information about how one sets up a sluice to get the gold out of the water. I mean, it's really the first inkling of his writing style that again mixes information plus imagination and poetry into one amazing soup. And so it's the genesis in a way of what he developed in the Pharmako books. And he would take those to these Renaissance fairs, and I think he sold them for $25.
Oh
But you have to go back to the 60s and realize ultimately what he did was, because he also was a master in the herbal lab, he created an herbal root beer with sassafras and other amazing ingredients. And so as the Renaissance fair continued over the years, he would have a place where he would sell this herbal root beer.
It's different than his absinthe,
The absinthe came later.
which he gave me a bottle in Ohio, I remember.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I suspect you don't have any more of it. There's basically none left.
Yeah.
But there are people who have apprenticed themselves and are now making
Similar formulas.
really, pretty good stuff. I mean, I will tell you a funny absinthe story before, but let me finish. So he created an herbal root beer that he called Osceola. And that actually ultimately went into production. So he had to figure out how do you go from making like 100 root beers at a fair to making, thousands in a bottle and distribute it. And the ironic thing is that Andrew Schelling, who I just mentioned, actually used to buy Osceola root beer in Berkeley before he ever met Dale. But Dale was a really incredible master at making elixirs. The one that he became most famous for was his wormwood mouthwash, which was really absinthe, and he based that, at least initially, on the old absinthe recipes. I've got books here that are formularies that explain how to, make and create all kinds of things. And as a young girl growing up and writing poetry, long before I ever met Dale, absinthe had caught my imagination, and I was always totally fascinated by it. Little did I ever think that I would actually taste the vrai absinthe, the real absinthe. So I drank a lot of Pernod. I was one of those people that if I was in a place where I was drinking, I would get Pernod, and they can cloud that, and it's absinthe without the psychotropic ingredients. And when Dale and I first met, I don't think it was one of the first things I found out about him, but by any means, because we met on a Zen retreat where we didn't even get to talk very much. But when we first began to spend time together, it was pretty magical, because all of a sudden, here was a guy who knew how to make the very substance that had shown up in poems that I'd written and everything else. And it was like, I remember going like, oh my God, this is, it's not like a dream come true, but it was just
synchronistic,
just beyond imagination that this, as I said, this substance that had shown up in poems that I'd been writing for years was all of a sudden there on the table in front of me, this green fairy elixir. So Dale and I met actually backpacking in Death Valley. I was living in New York and he was living over in Santa Rosa at the time. But the Zen community that we were both part of is located here in Nevada County up on the ridge. And I had signed up for what's called Mountains and Rivers. It's a backpacking session that I think Gary Snyder must have initiated years earlier. And Dale had come from Santa Rosa to be part of the group, and I'd come from New York to be part of the group, and the 15 of us all went into Death Valley for a week. And basically you hike during the day, and then you sit zazen at the morning and in the evening. And by the end of the week, there's not a lot of talking that goes on. But we drove back into civilization in the same car and started talking. And I think it was about 6 weeks later that I came out and visited with him. And his marriage had already pretty much fallen apart. My marriage was on its last legs. And I decided that while I figured out what I was going to do next, I wanted to come out here to Nevada County and live closer to the Zendo, because that seemed like a good place to suss things out. Mm-hmm. And so we were still, the width of California apart, But I moved out here and we started, it seems really funny to say dating, we were both in our 50s, but we started seeing each other, and it took about a year. And at that point we started to cohabitate. Mm-hmm. So we met through our Zen practice, but ironically, I was also doing artist books and writing poems. And he was writing and had a history of working with artist books and stuff. So we were the same age. We were both ending marriages of about the same length, and we had a spiritual practice. And so it turned out to be a pretty good fit for both of us.
Will you speak a little more on how your Zen practice has, I don't know, like, I'm really curious about what is that, how does that make you see the world differently, you know? I mean, I'm not asking you to necessarily speak for what Dale thought of it exactly, but just what is your experience with it?
Back when I was I was raised with no religion whatsoever.
In New York, right?
I was raised in New York City. My mom was a lapsed Catholic. She had left the church when she was 16. I suspect that perhaps a priest made a pass at her, but I was never, by the time I had figured that out, she had passed away. So I was never actually able to ask her that. My father was raised in a culturally Jewish family, but not a religious Jewish family. In other words, they didn't go to shul, they didn't go to temple, they didn't like light lights on Friday nights and have they didn't practice any of the holidays, at least not in his house. So when you take a lapsed Catholic and a non-practicing Jew and they get married, there's no religion whatsoever in the house. As I grew up and got into my teens, I guess I was curious to know more about spiritual practices. Most of my friends were Jewish. That was the form of our social life in New York City. You went to, dances that the various temples sponsored. So I began to think of myself as Jewish, but the Jewish religion wasn't a particularly good fit. And certainly what I'd seen of Catholicism when I visited with my mother's relatives, seemed not like a good fit. So I got curious about some of the Eastern religions, Vedanta in particular, to the extent that I actually went one day to a Vedanta place. And I remember kind of walking in there and getting really scared and turning around and leaving. And the whole thing just kind of went moot. When I was in my early 20s, I was introduced to rock climbing, which back then was something nobody knew about. And I started to climb regularly. There were no climbing gyms. There were no climbing ads. There were no climbing movies. I mean, it was really kind of an unknown sport. But I took to it, and that was that kind of, maybe you could call that my religion for the next 20 years or so. And then in Christmas of 1989, I had a very bad skiing accident, and I was laid up for months in bed. And when I was finally healed enough from the climbing accident to try and get back into shape, skiing accident to try and get back into shape for climbing, I contacted somebody who's now located in Durango named Steve Ilg, who has something that he calls holistic fitness. Now, again, we're going back to 1990, 1991. I mean, the concept of holistic fitness was not a common thing. And he had a 5-prong program, which was not just cardiac and muscle strength, but he also included meditation in his things. And he became my coach. And he had me start sitting 5 minutes a day. And so all of a sudden, this curiosity that had been part of my life briefly when I was 17 years old, kind of came back, and I was like, oh, cool, I get to sit 5 minutes a day. Well, I started sitting 5 minutes a day, and that turned into 10 minutes a day, and I found a teacher in the New York area. And I really found that the meditation practice suited me. Without realizing it, I had developed a meditation practice of my own years earlier by running every morning for about an hour, because it was the one time every day when I could just be with myself. And when I had the skiing accident, I couldn't run anymore. So I was really delighted to find a practice. A climbing friend of mine was a longtime Zen practitioner. So I kind of, said, so can you tell me a little bit about this Zen practice? And he directed me to Robert Aiken, who headed up the Honolulu Diamond Sangha in Hawaii. I went for a weekend, and Aiken Roshi was happy to take me on as a student. And I was still living in New York, so I started flying back and forth, to attend regular traditional Zen session, which is silence for a week. And when Aiken Roshi retired, he handed me over to Nelson Foster, who is the Roshi here at Ring of Bone in Nevada County, up on the ridge. So now I started to go back and forth, to sit with my new teacher. And that was 2 years, I think, later that I went on this backpacking session, which I was delighted to go on because it kind of took some of the things that were most important in my life, being in the mountains, having a pack on your back, walking on a trail, and meditating. And as I said, as it happened in this particular year, which was the spring of 1998, Dale and I wound up on the same backpacking session. And
had he been practicing for a long time?
He'd been practicing longer than I had, yeah. But also he started out with, well, he didn't start out, but he had Aiken Roshi in Hawaii as his teacher, and then, ultimately Nelson. His Zen practice in the 60s, he was living in Southern California. I don't know, in Westwood, maybe. And I'm sure that maybe when he was in prison, one of those 2 times he read Zen Bones with the Suzuki, I think it's the Suzuki book. Anyway, or Alan Watts, whatever, he had drifted in that direction. Probably not, if we were to compare our timelines, probably, kind of around the same time that I was interested briefly in Vedanta, but for him, it's his great curiosity and everything stuck. And I know that he sat in Los Angeles. I can't remember the name of the teacher right now, but with a very well-known and respected teacher in the LA area that I think Leonard Cohen's, his practice began with and remained with for many years. So his practice started much earlier, and one of his great mentors was a man that he actually met in a bookstore in the LA area, who later became the librarian at the Zen Center in San Francisco. I think I have all of this right. And who he stayed in touch with for many years. So, yeah, Zen was a big part. And then, of course, coming up here to the Ridge in the 70s, after he left Humboldt and the Trinities, there was a Zen community up here that Gary Snyder had started. And so they all sat in Gary's barn. And he was a very integral part of that, and he was part of the building crew for the Zendo that we sit in now, Ring of Bone. And so that was, a huge part of his life for much longer than it was a huge part of my life. There's a certain kind of focus that Zen can bring to you. There's also, on some days, it helps you to realize how illusory and impermanent things are.
Inevitably
I think it shows up more in his poems than it does in his books. So I think that if one was to look for the Zen influence in Dale's writing, one would have to look at his poetry. But certainly I would say it was influential in his entire, adult life.
Would you like to read something that he wrote?
Sure.
Maybe a poem or excerpt?
Sure, hold on. Let me see. A poem that's called The Ballad of the Hungry Ghosts. So in Zen practice, there are these creatures called hungry ghosts, and they have a head and a mouth and a very, very, very thin neck and a huge extended belly. And we make an offering to them when we eat during sesshin. But basically, because of the thin neck, they are always hungry. They can never, ever, ever get enough. They can never be satiated. So Dale takes the hungry ghosts here and likens them to politics. So let me see if I can do this one. The Ballad of the Hungry Ghosts. They have no breath, no bones, nor blood. They appear and then dissolve. Their only drive is for more and more until they own it all. They have no children or family, neighbors, or sense of shame. Their birth is a limited charter solely conceived for gain. They're called a corporate body and given the rights of men, denizens of the netherworld, to whom all flesh must bend. So Dale hated the fact that corporations had the rights of persons, and he railed against that and talked about it a lot. So that's a poem. So we also sit on what we call Rohatsu. So here's a poem that he wrote about Rohatsu. On Rohatsu it rained all night. Many temptations arose, a broad-hipped girl, alluring and interested, a chance or two to make a quick buck and let that other one make another. Family, filial piety. This boy is bad. He turned away from the ways of his parents. And then there was poetry, and plenty of wise words to sprinkle in. He touched the earth, and the morning star was said to smile. And what if he kept his mouth shut, like a good boy? Family dinners might be easier. Just listen to those Buddhas yapping. I should shut up. Okay. Would you please be quiet? Okay. Actually, no. In the morning it was still raining. So I chose that poem because, so the deal with the Buddha is, he was born Siddhartha to a very, very wealthy family. And then, I don't know, when he was and he was kept in an enclosed place so he couldn't see the suffering of all the other beings out there in the world. And somehow in his teenage years, he escaped and he saw beggars and people who needed things and were suffering. And he went back in, and even though he was married and he had a child, I believe at that point, he left to go among those people. And so I think what Dale's doing here is he's making an analogy that, he turned away from the way of his parents to save everybody. And let's see. There's other lovely poems in here. Unfortunately, this book is also out of print and almost impossible to get.
The one you were just reading.
Yeah, so we might try and pull some of the poems
Salting the Boundaries
in there out, because that's not going to see a reprint. It's called Living with Barbarians, and it was for, what was the event? It was a limited edition published for the 16th annual Brighton Bush Hot Springs Herbal Conference in August of 1999. So I'm trying to, okay, so the first poem in here is one of the ones that he's most well known and quoted on the internet for. It's called Medicine. As dreams are the healing songs from the wilderness of our unconscious, so wild animals, wild plants, wild landscapes are the healing dreams from the deep singing mind of the earth. We'll call this one, this is called Spirit Song. How many places have we gone together? How often, a breeze rising, have you two moved through me? How often behind barred windows, in soft voices between men, have you risen in the steam from the past cup? A mighty tree left alone in swirling air or felled to stillness, my companion. Perhaps I could have had you anyway, even never moving. But what man or woman could resist the questing when you beckon with roaring, white foam-specked forests with horizons all lost in mist? Who would not go to chase you and then return, hearing the chained men laugh, or watching the cut stump sprout? And I hope I identified that's called Spirit Song.
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Well.
And here we'll read one more. Stone Crop. Adapted to drought and rock, and less soil than would fill a thimble, a true cliffhanger. The stone crop's leaves are thick and tough to save water. In the plant press, after a week, it looked, though flattened, as green as fresh. I left it another week, checked again. The leaves still green and full. I doubled the blotters, pulled hard on the straps, stuck it away on a warm shelf, and forgot about it until spring. Reaching up from the rosette of the still undried leaves, a fleshy albino stem, no chlorophyll, but wanting to flower.
That seems like a good segue to talking about his herbarium.
Okay. So Dale started collecting plants in a plant press. Boy, I don't know exactly when. 70s. He studied with an Hoopa herb woman in the Trinities. He would find plants, I guess, along the trail and bring them back to her. And I don't know if he had any formal botany training. I honestly don't know that. He may have taken a class, but he had all those horrible manuals that, it's like, is it going this way or that way? Is it going up or down? Is it going wider? Is it
I'm one of those people that hangs out with those.
And then you go down and you go down and you go down and you go down to try and figure out which one you've actually got. And ultimately he created over 1,000 pressed plant specimens, which lived in a herbarium, in a wooden box that he built, all categorized. He was amazing about, where he got it and what date and what he identified it as being. And before he passed, he was really concerned about the herbarium, because he knew that although I know books, I didn't know this at all. We were very, very lucky to contact Wendy Bowes, who's a botanist that lives up on the ridge. And she took a look at what was there, worked with Dale the last couple of months that he was alive, to sometimes figure out exactly where he might have found things, and ultimately contacted the herbarium, the Jepson Herbarium down in Berkeley, and they took all 1,100 specimens.
They're all there now.
They're all there now, except for, I don't know, about a dozen which I have framed.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all down there. They are in the process, working with an intern, to put those little pieces of tape on them, and kind of clean up some of the specimens that need cleaning up, and then entering them in the database, and they'll be available. However that all works, you're probably more familiar with that than I am.
Was it just this area, Nevada County, or was it
Mostly,
all over?
Mostly.
Okay.
It was the Trinities also. There's some from Southern California, but it's primarily this area, and Wendy's the person who can fill you in on that, even if you do it by email. Mm-hmm. She'll know how to answer that far better than I will. I mean, I have to admit that I lived with that herbarium for years and years and years, and Dale showed it to me from time to time, but I did not appreciate, I was kind of too naive or oblivious to realize not only the value of it, but what he had actually accomplished. I mean, it was just like, okay, I just didn't have that knowledge base and appreciation, and there was so much other stuff going on that I couldn't kind of divert myself to take a look at it.
Was he still pressing plants?
Yes. Yes, he was still pressing plants, even in his notebook, pretty much almost up until the end. We would go for a walk someplace, and if I look at some of his journals from the last couple of months that he was alive, if he was out and about, he would pick something and press it. And at one point, there was something up here that I wanted to press, because I was a little bit more educated by now. And there were 2 plant presses that were loose here. And so I figured, okay, I'll just use, they were all full of plants.
Wow. You couldn't press anything because they were already full.
Right. So it was really interesting. So we have some plant presses that he made actually out of cardboard with straps, and then we have other plant presses that are the official kind, that are wooden and everything. But they still have things in them. I think Wendy may have taken some of them.
I'll try to figure out
not
what
the
they
presses, but just, I think Dale had them labeled.
Oh, really?
He knew where he had collected them. The date was there. The place was there. So yeah, this was something that he continued to do. And we have books, where he, everything's numbered. So it's not like he just pressed a bunch of plants there. This was specimen number 387 and specimen number 492. And, it's all
organized.
He was really good taxonomously in that way. I mean, he was careful. And then in the last couple of years, when his attention and curiosity returned to geology, we would go driving all the way up towards Susanville and everything and collect rocks. And again, if he collected a rock, by now, of course, we had iPhones, so he could get the exact latitude and longitude of where he had collected the rock.
GPS coordinates.
And give it a number, and then come back here and look at it and try and figure out exactly what it was. And so yeah, no, it that's part of how his mind worked. I mean, it was this unbelievably well organized, and you can kind of get a sense of that looking around the library. I mean, the books are for the most part organized, by subject.
It's like a library.
Yeah. I mean,
It's
we
like
don't
a
have a
dream
Dewey
library.
we don't have a Dewey decimal system, but if you're looking for, a particular topic, you just have to. I remember after Dale passed, I wanted to read something by Alan Watts, and I had to kind of put myself into Dale's mindset and figure out, okay, so where would Alan Watts's books be?
What category?
But I did finally find them, and there they were, I don't know, 6, 8, 10, 12 of them all lined up next to each other. It's, yeah. And you can just also see, if you look around the library, all the different things that interest him. He was very, very interested in linguistics. His dad was a Methodist minister. So even though he walked away from Methodism in his teen years, he was infused with, Christian religion, for most of his young life, you don't get to have a dad who's a Methodist minister and kind of not learn about. And so we loved to do crossword puzzles together. Well, I loved to do crossword puzzles all my life. And so when we met, I kind of roped Dale into crossword puzzles. And he's a fantastic crossword puzzle companion, because his breadth of knowledge was just so amazing. And I could always be sure that if there was a Bible reference or, one of the...
You knew he would know.
he always knew who the prophets were, I mean, it sure made that part of doing crossword puzzles a hell of a lot easier. But he was also very fascinated by linguistics and archaeology and Indian petroglyphs, which you see in the Gold Dust Wilderness, because he incorporated a lot of petroglyphs that he had encountered in. I mean, he was just a pretty amazing person to be around. And when I can separate myself from my grief about the loss and remember just how amazing it was, to be intimately in his presence, most of the time, I remember to be incredibly grateful, for that. And he was generous with his knowledge. I mean, he never got like snuffy, like, you don't know about that? There was no ego, kind of blasting in neon, like you might find with, your own experience of him,
You would never know that he knew so much.
Yeah. He wasn't obnoxious about it or anything. He was just about sharing and passing it on. And, I think that's why over the years a lot of people flocked to him, whether it was at Burning Man or at conferences or just, if they could figure out how to find us. I mean, the books certainly put him out into the world. But once people realized that he was this kind of amazing source of not just knowledge, but wisdom. People wanted to just hang out, and we were always open to that. It was fine. So.
What's your plan with all of this? I mean, it's
I
like...
have no clue. The next step, well, a lot of the drug research books that Dale accumulated while he was writing the Pharmako books have gone to Arrowwood.
For people who don't know what Arrowwood is, what...
Arrowwood it's arrowwood.org. It was started about 20 years ago by two kids who were drug geeks. And so they wanted to know what all these different drugs were. And being the age that they were and how curious they were, they started a website so that if you encountered some drug, LSD or ecstasy or XYZ 123, there would be a place where you could look it up. And they published trip reports so that you're not just getting, the information that might show up in a medical journal, but you're also getting, I took this amount and 3 hours later I was still wondering what was going to happen, or I took this amount and 3 minutes later I was on a trip that lasted 3 days. It has become the major source in emergency rooms.
Wow.
If somebody comes in and they're on something and they garble out, or people that are with them can garble out what it is, and of course the docs in the ER room go like, I've never even heard of that. They can go to arrowwood.org and find information. It is now a 501c3 organization, so it operates completely on donations. They do an amazing service to the world community. They are a phenomenal source of information. And so Dale had accumulated lots and lots of books, research for writing the Pharmako series. And I made basically a pass through all of those books and kind of tried to decide, well, would I ever actually look at this book or not? Because Arrowwood now has a lending library.
Oh, cool.
And they're located just down the road between here and Auburn.
I didn't know they had a physical spot.
Yeah. And I called them up and said, want some books? And so they came just fairly recently and walked out, I think, with 10 boxes of books. And now I have to go through the rest of the books that are still there and kind of do a second pass. As for these other books, I don't know yet. The next thing is to go through Dale's papers and file cabinets and everything and figure out what he has, and then contact a research library. The library at Davis has all of the stuff about Kuksu, which is the zine that he did. It was one of the first backcountry zines. They weren't called zines back then, but one of the first backcountry literary. There's 6 issues.
Right, you gave me a copy.
Yeah.
Or one that was a copy of the original last time I was here.
Yeah. And so there were 6 issues, and all of the research, the communications between Dale and other writers and everything are at Davis. So it would make sense, once I know what's in these other cabinets, to see if Davis would want to have everything together in one place, so that if somebody wants to research Dale's writing at some point. But before I can do that, I have to find out what's in the boxes. So that's a project for later this year. And if I can find a home for all of that, then I can begin to address the books. We have some connections with people who worked at places like Moe's and Logos, which doesn't exist anymore in Santa Cruz. And I'm hoping that when that time comes, they can help me figure out. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff here. Whether it's,
I
could open up a used bookstore
or a residency or something
Yeah.
for people who are like him, you know, to come and use it all as it is. 'Cause
Well,
it's
yeah,
amazing.
that
Yeah.
if there's somebody that wants to do that, that's fine. I don't know how to access those people, but I have spoken to people that I know who are in the academic world, and everybody agrees that his papers should be someplace. And then at some point, I'm going to have to do something with, or at least figure out where the books should go. Mm-hmm. I'm not particularly interested in denuding all of the shelves here at this time. I mean, I don't want to walk in here and not see books. So it's probably going to be more like figuring out, okay, all of the books on this subject should go to this place, then should go to this place, so that when the time comes, the people behind me know what to do with it. Andrew Schelling, who I've mentioned before, is actually the literary executor behind me. So that may fall in his lap at some future date, and he's actually better versed in all of that than I am. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of esoteric books here, for example.
I'm loving that because like I said, I studied philosophy and religion, so that was my favorite part of the library. and so it's nice to glimpse over the different authors and stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a lifetime of book collecting. It's not something that Dale took up 20 years ago. I like to tell the story that when I moved out here in 1998, I think I had 50 boxes of books that moved from New York. When I met Dale, he was the only person I had ever met in my life who had more books than I had. Pretty much probably 3 books to every one that I had.
Wow.
So we already had a hell of a lot of books between us. And that's probably my it's like, I don't know, women that buy jewelry or something. I buy books, and in case you're wondering, no, every book in this library has not been read cover to cover, but they've all been read in part. Mm-hmm. They don't make it here without being opened and perused, at least for the particular chapter you're interested in or whatever. So, and then between us, we also have, an incredible poetry collection. I mean, I've collected a lot of poetry. He has, and then he has books that were signed to him, chapbooks and poetry books.
From other people.
It's a considerable collection, and we collected a lot of art books over the years. I mean, it's just there's a lot of good stuff here.
Is there anything you want to leave folks with about, anything else that you want to say about Dale or about...
He left too soon.
Yeah.
And I hope that what he said at the end was that if people were looking for I'm going to say his take on the world and things, they should look to what he'd written.
You just listened to a conversation with Laura Pendell on the work of Dale Pendell, and the interstitial music for this episode is the Momentary Prophets, and the song is called Drawing the White. The Momentary Prophets was a band from my college days over 10 years ago in Virginia, and it includes several friends, and I always really love their music, and it's kind of timeless to me and never really gets old. And I just have been listening to their music a lot lately, and I just thought, I'm going to weave Momentary Prophet songs into the podcast. It's going to be great. And you can still buy their music. I'm going to link their Bandcamp in the show notes. So their music's really sweet, and they have a couple albums on there. And they're not together anymore, although I would love if they were. But please do visit their Bandcamp to listen to more of their work. So I think that's all, y'all. Until next time. This episode of the Groundshots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.